brain is amazing. From the moment you were born, it's been learning and growing. It's been adapting. It's been creating. And it's been cleansing. Your brain is a master at filtering through and storing massive amounts of information, making it possible for you to make powerful decisions and helping you achieve your goals in life. But something's gone very wrong. Mental illness, anxiety, and depression are all skyrocketing. More and more people are forgetting things, suffering from brain fog and confusion, while rates of dementia are getting higher and higher.
Many of us think that all of this is just an inevitable consequence of growing older. We look around and we see that fully half of those who are 85 have gotten Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. And this kind of aging has become so common that most of our doctors tell us it's normal for us to become increasingly forgetful and increasingly confused and eventually to end up with dementia. But is this really how it's supposed to be?
In this episode, we're going to take a look at your brain and how it works. We'll explore the epidemic of brain diseases and conditions and find out what we can do about it. And we'll also look at how you can set your brain up to perform at its best so you can have a clear mind and a good memory even if you live to 100.
Let's start by meeting your miraculous brain.
This is the organ that makes us who we are. This is the thing that actually is ourselves. The rest of the body is just a vessel that carries the brain. It might not be popular with cardiologists and nephrologists, but we are our brain. The moment that the brain is replaced, we are the other brain. The brain is an incredible tool that actually gives us our awareness, consciousness, continuity in life, joys, pleasures, pains, every experience. And it's affected by our environment. This little 3-pound organ, 2% of body's weight, actually consumes 25% of body's energy. And the reason is because it has that important of a purpose.
So the human brain is involved in everything you do, how you think, how you feel, how you act, how you get along with other people. And it's divided left side, right side, cerebellum. The front part of the brain, the front third of the brain, is the prefrontal cortex, largest in humans and any other animal by far. It's involved with our most human functions: forethought, judgment, impulse control, organization, planning, empathy. It's also connected. Every part of the brain is connected to every other part of the brain, sort of like a symphony, to your emotional brain, or what neuroscientists call the limbic brain, your temporal lobes underneath your temples and behind your eyes, involved with memory, mood stability, language, temper control. Parietal lobes at the top back of your brain sort of bring the world in. It's where many of your senses are. And your occipital lobes in the back involved with vision. And your brain's just so amazing.
Neuron is the working unit of a brain. It's the small little soldier. It's the small little element that actually gives information and transfers information. And there are 87 billion of them connected, sending messages, actually transferring messages, and creating a greater awareness. Those little neurons are powerful. It's electrical, it's actually electrochemical, meaning that the way that sodium and potassium work in these connections create a charge, and that charge actually transfers information. Sometimes it's direct, other times it has these neurotransmitters that are released, which are packages of information that goes to the next neuron, and that's how it transfers information. The most vascular organ in the body is not the heart, it's not any other organ, it's the brain. If you look at the images of brain denuded of all other cells and just look at the vasculature, you are amazed at how is there any room for anything else. It's the most vascular organ, and that's why it consumes 25% of oxygen. That's why it consumes at times as much as 25% of energy and as much as 50% of oxygen. And because those cells need that. And the only way we look at it as a clinician is after something has happened, after somebody has a transient ischemic attack or a stroke, we look at the big vessels and we say, oh, look, they had a stroke. But what about all those end vessels, which usually people don't check? And we see them because people with cognitive decline come to us and we see small little white matter disease. And that white matter disease, most of the time, is vascular or inflammation, but it's still vascular. So we say that the disease process starts with the vascular phenomenon, and now it's been corroborated that even prior to amyloid, which is not the direct marker of Alzheimer's, but a marker, even prior to that, vascular disease starts ahead of anything else for Alzheimer's, for vascular dementia, and many other dementias.
There's a very clear association between increased LDL cholesterol and brain health. As Dean was mentioning earlier, there's a very strong body of research showing that Alzheimer's disease and dementias in general have a very strong cardiovascular or at least vascular component to them. It's not just the deposition of amyloid beta protein. It's not just the deposition of tau tangles in the brain. A lot of the problems actually start because of the neurovascular unit not functioning properly. And high LDL is a main contributor to it. There have been multiple studies that show that when people have uncontrolled high LDL, especially during their midlife, they tend to have higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and definitely vascular dementia later on, whether it's in observational studies, whether it's in studies that have looked at consumption of foods that increase LDL cholesterol, and in basic science research as well. So we have multiple lines of studies shows that when people control their LDL during their midlife and it's on the lower side, they have lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. For example, there was one study, Kaiser Permanente study, close to about 10,000 individuals followed for many years. They checked their midlife cholesterol, and those who had high cholesterol during their midlife had a 57% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And even people who had moderate levels of cholesterol that usually are not addressed and kind of left alone, they had increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as well. So it's important to address that as soon as possible.
Many of us have come to think of the brain as almost separate from the rest of the body. But is it possible that our brains are far more connected to our gut and our nervous system than most of us have ever imagined?
We live in a world of reductionist approaches to human physiology and certainly medicine, meaning that it seems convenient to compartmentalize the human body for purposes of understanding how it works, though that's a flawed approach, and also for purposes of triaging how healthcare is provisioned. And by that I mean, Descartes, originally a French philosopher, characterized the human body as being made up of separate parts. The lung serving as a bellows, the heart as a pump, etc. And this is what we call, it reduces the body to its individual parts and functionality. So it's called a reductionist mentality. And it never has served us well. So the whole notion that there's this new idea called the gut-brain connection, I'm always tickled by that.
The connection between gut and brain is becoming clearer and clearer to us. There is the vagus nerve, which is one of the cranial nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, that actually directly connects to the GI system and activates and deactivates the parasympathetic system in the gut, so that you actually feel the emotions in the gut as well. There are actually neurons from the brain going into the stomach, giving information to the stomach minute by minute according to your emotions, to your mood, to your cognitive state, so that intestines, but especially the upper gut, which is the GI, the stomach, and the rest of the upper gut, actually respond to it. But then the gut itself, be it from the stomach all the way to the colon, has this relationship with the central nervous system. The food it produces, the food that it breaks down, the fiber that we take in and creates these short chain fatty acids that actually protect the blood-brain barrier. The brain's blood-brain barrier is critically important. It's an incredibly hermetically sealed environment, and nothing's supposed to get through there. So the relationship is immense. And that's just the direct. The indirect is the fact that the foods we eat and the microbiome create everything that we need for the brain, the most active, the most energy-hungry system in the body. So if we give it bad food, then the GI system will actually produce toxins and byproducts that are detrimental short-term and long-term to the brain. So the relationship is powerful at so many levels.
The kind of emotions that we feel on a day-to-day basis is a very complex relationship between our brain and the GI system. They're in constant communication with each other, and obviously whatever we do in our day-to-day lives affects that relationship. And we have found from multiple studies that the best cognition occurs, or people reach their peak performance as far as their cognition is concerned, when they are in a state of rest and digest. Constant activation of sympathetic activity can cause lack of focus and lack of drive. So anything that provides that peace and that state of hyper focus improves memory and improves our longevity as well.
We're learning more and more every day about the gut microbiome, a collection of trillions of microbes that makes a huge difference to whether we're healthy or not. And it's now scientifically indisputable that many of these microbes directly affect brain health.
Yeah.
We know that to a significant degree, the gut bacteria are playing a role in how the brain is able to use fuel moment to moment and power itself. The brain is a very energy dependent organism. By and large, the fuel that the brain is using day to day is glucose, though it has the ability to utilize ketones, but we really need to focus on glucose, and the glucose utilization of the brain requires that the brain be able to utilize or respond to a hormone called insulin. And this insulin sensitivity is directly affected by the state of functionality of the gut bacteria. Who knew? So in that way, the gut bacteria are playing such a dramatic role moment to moment in how our brains are even working. Beyond that, we know that our gut bacteria are involved in the production of other chemicals. Chemicals like what are called short-chain fatty acids. These short-chain small fats, if you will, produced in the gut by the gut bacteria are at times utilized for fuel in the brain, but more importantly, act as signal modulators, can affect how neurons are able to communicate with each other, and even perhaps more importantly, they affect gene expression within the brain. They regulate to some degree which parts of the DNA in brain cells are working at any given moment and which are actually shut off.
What happens in our gut impacts digestion and the health of our brain, but does it also impact our mood and how we feel?
Absolutely. So in the trillions of organisms that we have in our gut, the billions of different species in genera that we have down there, there are some in the clearly labeled as the bad guy, problem maker groups, the bacteria, but their mirror image are the good guys in the Firmicutes phylum, and these are much more benign microbes, and they thrive on healthy plant fibers, which again, that whole food plant-based style of eating puts down lots of fiber that the microbes will metabolize into short-chain fatty acids that keep our gut healthy. They also crowd out some of the other pathogens down there. But very importantly, Firmicutes that you mentioned are, again, they aren't passive bystanders. They will take many of the sugars and proteins that come down, metabolize them, and the byproducts of the bacteria release, their waste products, turn out to be neurotransmitters, turn out to be dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin, and these feel-good molecules that can then find their way up to our brains and nervous system, either through our the venous return system or going up through our vagus nerve. But the byproducts of the Firmicutes microbes turn out to can have a beneficial effect on our mood. And so many patients, many people, when they adopt a plant-based, I lost weight, my bowels got better, my joints stopped hurting, and by the way, I just started feeling better. I started feeling happier. And I thought, that's interesting, a soft sign, but no mechanism for that. Well, it turns out that you change your gut microbes and they're putting feel-good chemicals in your brain. And yes, not your imagination, it's biochemistry. And another validation from the universe. Yeah.
The gut-brain connection is really so important to understand when it comes to the food-mood connection and nutritional psychiatry. It is one of the mechanisms by which we understand that food impacts mental health. It turns out that the gut and brain originate from the exact same cells in the human embryo, and then they divide up to form two separate organs of the body. And these two organs, the brain and the gut, then remain connected throughout life by the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. And this I like to call a two-way text messaging system, sending chemical messages back and forth all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And this starts to help us understand how food comes into the picture. Now, serotonin is often called the happiness hormone, but 90 to 95% of serotonin is made in the gut, and the receptors are in the gut, as well as other neurochemicals. And as we eat our food and digestion begins, the breakdown particles of the food interact with the trillions of microbes that reside in the gut. These microbes are there to really help us, not harm us. But it also depends on what we eat, Ocean. So if we are eating a healthier meal, rich in plant foods and beans and nuts and seeds and legumes, really which bring fiber to the gut, then the breakdown products are really healthy. And the little microbes break down these products and you get things like short-chain fatty acids being formed. But if we're tending towards more of a fast food diet and unhealthy types of foods that are high in sugar, for example, then the bad microbes, who also live in the gut, they start to thrive. And when they start to thrive, that becomes a problem. And I say this about the breakdown of food to make that connection back to food, to food and mood, because when we are causing more inflammation in the gut and creating negative substances in the gut, you also see an uptick of mental health symptoms.
So the food you eat shapes the health of your microbiome, which in turn has a profound impact on how you feel. Might the food you eat also impact the way that you think?
Especially since the start of the pandemic, more and more people have been talking about brain fog. But what actually is brain fog? And does your diet and lifestyle affect it?
If you think of what brain fog is, it's sort of analogous to what's happening in a de-optimized metabolic state. If you're gunking up the machinery, you're going to feel that effect physiologically one way or another. And most patients manifest with, that lethargy, this, confused, almost sort of just the way you can explain it is you just feel suboptimal. You just feel like you're groggy, you're not 100% on point.
Brain fog is something that years ago nobody ever heard of. When I first started using that term, because that's what I felt I had when I was in my 20s and my health was failing, and people look at me like, what the heck is brain fog? I've never heard of that before. But it's this feeling like your brain isn't firing on all cylinders, and it's not, right? And you're looking at somebody who you know, and you're trying to remember their name. And they're speaking to you, and it's as if there's a fog between you and them, and you can't get the information that they're sharing into your own brain. And what causes that? Insulin resistance causes that. Metabolic imbalances where the brain just can't pick up the nutrients that we're supplying it, right? It can't make transmit the neurotransmitters, which go from one cell to the next to say, hey, move that hand, right? Oh, think that thought, find that stored information that you put in there 20 years ago maybe. And we normally should be able to do that, but we can't because the brain doesn't have the nutrition it needs. It can't make the neurotransmitters it needs. There's toxicity in the brain, and it can't get the sugar from the blood in there because of insulin resistance. That's what I believe causes brain fog.
Food's relationship with brain fog is such that over time, when there are harmful elements that are introduced in our body, say for example, a lot of ultra-processed foods or too much refined carbohydrates, or over a long period of time when lipid metabolism is not taken care of, those are some of the pathways that can damage the brain, and the brain can experience cognitive impairment. So we always say the 4 prongs of pathology in the brain are oxidation, inflammation, glucose dysregulation, and lipid or fat dysregulation. So it could come from any of those paths.
Your brain does a lot for you, and a lot of that happens behind the scenes, maintaining homeostasis, regulating your heart rate and blood pressure, and so on. I actually think that the human brain is one of the true wonders of the world. And I remember Dr. Dean Sherzai saying earlier that in a real sense we are our brains because we are our memories.
So the area of the brain that textbooks talk about, where is a kind of a switching area for our memories, is the hippocampus. It looks like a seahorse, if you will. But there's other research that suggests that memory is contained in every one of our cells. I mean, even when we talk about our brain cells, we have 87 billion neurons, 87 billion neurons. And each of these brain cells have upwards of 10,000 synapse connections. You know, when you think about all the connections, that's more connections than there are stars in the known universe. I mean, it is absolutely tremendous. But when it comes to memory, it's interesting that it's not really taught in school, right? They teach you what to remember, math, history, science, Spanish, but there's zero classes on how to remember. You know, they teach you 3 R's, and at least here in the States, they say reading, writing, arithmetic. Obviously, spelling is not one of them. But what about recall? What about retention? Socrates said learning is remembering, and I always thought remembering should have been taught back in school. Approximately 1/3 of our memory, for instance, is predetermined by genetics and biology. And that leaves about 2/3 in our control. And that's really our lifestyle. And that's really exciting. What I would say is there's definitely things that you could do, which one of the most important things is the food you eat. Your brain is only maybe 2% of your body mass, but it requires 20% of the nutrients. And it requires some nutrients that are different than the rest of your body. And so I'm really excited about this topic because what you eat matters, especially for your gray matter. And what you eat matters, especially for your gray matter. So certainly part of it is biological, but then also it's the nature, but it's also the nurture. And so it's the food we eat, it's our self-talk, it's the amount of movement we have throughout the day, it's the quality of the relationships that we have with individuals, it's our environment and how our external world is a reflection of our internal world. So a clean environment gives you clarity of thought. It's prioritizing our sleep. It's also protecting our brain, wearing a helmet.
Learning depends on one kind of memory, the kind you may have used cramming for a test or practicing a second language. But there's another kind of memory that all of us use in everyday life, just remembering where we put the keys, where we parked the car, whether we paid the utility bill, and on an even more fundamental level, recognizing people and places and even remembering who we are.
When that kind of memory starts eroding, the effects can be devastating, and we're now experiencing an epidemic of dementia that we've never seen before.
So if you're concerned about the possibility of developing Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, what are the top warning signs to watch out for?
Some of the top signs that actually bring concern to patients that gets them to our door are things like they forgot things that they wouldn't have forgotten before. Now, yeah, we all forget where we placed the key. When we forgot where we put the car, or sometimes as much as what kind of car we had, that little moment, that's of concern. When people forget the names of some close family members, that's a concern. When they forget what they were supposed to do the next minute, the next hour, on a little bit more regular basis, that's a concern. The change in forgetfulness is important. Not just forgetfulness. We all have the forgetfulness because most of the time it's because we are nervous, we're anxious, we're busy. But when it comes on a regular basis, a little more than regular, that should be sign, and that's usually the signs where people say, "Uh-oh, something's wrong." They come to us for a checkup. The biological basis of majority of Alzheimer's is multidimensional. People come to Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, and a lot of dementias from different pathways. If you have uncontrolled diabetes, insulin resistance, that's a push. That's an element that can push you over the precipice. It's usually not the only thing, it's a combination, but it's the one thing that pushes it. If you have high cholesterol, definitely. We seem to be a little more pushing, going towards that direction. Cholesterol, LDL cholesterol is a big factor. Inflammation, we see this in traumatic brain injuries. We see this in infections and post-infectious processes. Oxidation, which is from the fat, again, and other ways as well. So you can come to this disease or these kind of diseases from different pathways, and usually combination thereof, which is empowering again. These things that I just described are things that we can do something about. If it's amyloid, what am I going to do with amyloid? But thankfully, it's not amyloid. At least for the great majority, it's these things that we have control over, and not with some weird thing. It's with things you can do in your home.
A simple way to think about it is that all cases of Alzheimer's disease are influenced by your metabolic state. And so if you develop an insulin-resistant lifestyle in which you are consuming, generally speaking, a large quantity of dietary fat, not necessarily dietary sugar, but dietary fat, that can create an insulin-resistant state inside of your liver and muscle tissue, in addition to affecting your liver and muscle, that insulin-resistant state has negative effects on your brain. So as a result, it can negatively impact your central nervous system, which isn't necessarily detectable right now, but it can manifest over the course of 30 to 40 to 50 years and eventually result in dementia, which can then progress towards Alzheimer's disease in the future.
Many people are terrified of developing dementia, of losing the ability to take care of even their most basic needs, of becoming a burden on their loved ones, of wasting away while forgetting everything that was once meaningful about their lives.
A lot of people think that whether we develop dementia or not is basically just a roll of the dice, and we have little to no control over it. Is this true? Is brain deterioration an inevitable consequence of growing old?
Is brain deterioration inevitable is a very important question. Yes, it's inevitable. I mean, even if we live the healthiest life, best life, I think that if you live to 200, you'll have brain deterioration. But we're not even close to that. Reality is 0.4% of Americans live a healthy diet life by American Heart Association standard, which is not the best standard. Majority of Americans or Westerners even move to the extent that we need to. Now we know that we need to actually move and exercise aerobically more than 150 minutes, actually up to 300 minutes a week if we want to. The truth is that it's the cumulative effect of all of these things that has an incredible effect, and we can maintain cognitive activity well into our 90s and beyond. But if we don't push it, then the deterioration starts way before 60s. Actually, we think that starts in our 20s or even earlier. The studies that show that children that eat really poor diet and are inactive have white matter disease, something that you don't even expect in elderly. So we really have to widen the spectrum, not to think of deterioration starting later in life. It can start earlier, or it can be delayed profoundly well into your 90s and beyond.
Based on our research and the fabulous research that exists there, only about 3% of Alzheimer's dementia is purely driven by genetics. The rest of them are an interplay between many different genes that are not quote-unquote Alzheimer's genes. These are genes that are responsible for things like better glucose metabolism or lipid regulation or getting rid of garbage or the byproducts in our body. So these are lifestyle genes, and we believe, and we've actually said it in our book, that more than 90% of specific Alzheimer's types can actually be prevented with a very healthy lifestyle.
One of the most important studies was done by Rush University and looking at the MIND diet. This is a combination of Mediterranean and DASH diet, and it's actually the only study that showed a combination diet like that specifically for brain health and its outcome. And the outcome was actually pretty remarkable. People on a MIND diet, adherent to MIND diet, actually reduced their risk of Alzheimer's by 53%. And that's remarkable. The MIND diet, when you actually deconstruct it, is a plant-centered diet, mostly plants, and they've actually reduced the amount of fish requirement and chicken, and we think it's despite having some chicken in there that people do well, and optimizing that diet, people can actually do even better. But it's much more centered around plants across the board. It's never too late to do something positive. Even in a fulminant Alzheimer's patient, eating healthier, exercising has been shown to actually slow down the process and is beneficial. But as far as reversing disease, once a person is in the full fight with Alzheimer's, they already have Alzheimer's and it's pretty moderate to severe, they're not going to reverse it. There's no evidence at this point that they can reverse it. And some people who have made those claims that it's a misdiagnosis of the initial disease. And you can put those people on those lifestyles, but there should be a calculus. Is the cost benefit there? To change a person who's already got Alzheimer's, change everything in their life might be more anxiety and pain than otherwise.
Regardless of whatever kind of genetic cards we've been dealt, we can reshuffle the deck with diet. So how can we prevent Alzheimer's disease? Well, you can correlate the blood flow to the memory centers of the brain, to these little cerebral arteries. You can do these kind of MRI scans of your blood vessels, and you can correlate how much blood flow you get into the memory centers of your brain and your risk of not only Alzheimer's disease, end-stage dementia, but also cognitive decline as we age. Of course, when you shrink the blood supply, when you prevent waste products from being removed from the part of the brain, well, no wonder you're going to get problems. And so that's why long-term plant-based eaters 3 times lower likelihood of developing dementia in their lifetime. Well, it makes sense because they have more blood flow. You say, wait a second, how can the same diet also be heart healthy and brain healthy at the same time? Well, because every single organ in our body needs blood flow for oxygen, for nutrients, to get rid of waste products. So, of course, a brain healthy diet is going to be a heart healthy diet, it's going to be a liver healthy diet, it's going to be a kidney healthy diet, right? And what's a plant-based diet? It's an anti-inflammatory diet. And so any disease that has some kind of inflammatory component, well, the same diet is going to be the same diet for all of these inflammatory conditions. And so a heart healthy diet is a brain healthy diet. And in fact, Dr. Dean Ornish, after conquering killer number 1, moved on to killer number 2, cancer, and was the first to show a reversal of the progression of early stage prostate cancer with the same kind of plant-based diet and lifestyle, and is currently running a trial trying to reverse Alzheimer's disease. Whether it's going to be possible or not, who knows? Better to prevent it in the first place.
In earlier episodes, we've seen that saturated fat is linked to cardiovascular disease. But is it also linked to your risk of Alzheimer's?
One of the really disturbing findings that came from Chicago. And this was the Chicago Health and Aging Project. And this goes back to 2003. They had been following a group of people in the city of Chicago for about 10 years, and they looked at what they ate for breakfast. They looked at what they ate for lunch, and they looked at what they ate for dinner, and they teased out the foods that were high in saturated fat. That means dairy, number 1, meat, number 2. And what they found blew the scientific community away. That those people in the city of Chicago who were eating more saturated fat had about 2 to 3 times the Alzheimer's risk compared to people generally avoiding it. Now, I got to tell you, people in Chicago are not really avoiding saturated fat. It was not as if there was a group of thousands of vegans avoiding saturated fat completely. You just didn't see that. But what they did find is that even within that city, the rather small differences in saturated fat intake made a huge difference in whether a dementing illness would arrive at your doorstep.
What about coconut oil? There's a lot of people touting, especially MCT oil, made from which is extracted from coconut oil for possible brain health benefits. And then there's people that mix it with coffee and think it's something of a superfood. Other folks say it's super highly saturated and you should absolutely avoid it. What does the research tell us?
The research on coconut oil has changed and we're learning more and more about it. To summarize our understanding of coconut oil and its health benefit, there's been consensus among scientists and different people who study nutrition and around the world that it definitely is a very heavy source of saturated fats from plants, and consumption of saturated fats has been associated with poor cardiovascular outcomes and brain health, and specifically Alzheimer's disease. So eating coconut oil in general is not a good idea. As far as MCT or medium chain triglycerides are concerned, it's a highly processed oil. Yes, some components may be beneficial, and some animal studies and very small short-term human different studies have shown that it could potentially improve cognition, but the data is not strong enough as of yet for us to recommend it at a population level.
What about blood sugar? Are your blood sugar levels connected to your risk of developing dementia?
So as blood sugar levels go up to be pre-diabetic or diabetic, or even in the high normal range, it's been associated with brain atrophy, especially in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which are on the inside of your temporal lobes, underneath your temples, behind your eyes. The hippocampus, when it shrinks, people have trouble getting memory into long-term storage. And they also get more depressed. And Alzheimer's disease, by some people, is called type 3 diabetes. And so if you have a high risk for Alzheimer's, you really want to get your hemoglobin A1C under 5.5. It's just so critical. And how do you do it? Is you decrease the simple carbohydrates in your diet. There are also some supplements I like quercetin and berberine, that they can be very effective in lowering your blood sugar. But what you eat is critical. And the more fiber you can eat, to a point that's tolerable, it helps to balance your blood sugar as well.
Alzheimer's is a disease that affects individuals, but it also impacts the families of these people, often in tragic ways. My own mother, Ocean's grandmother, died of Alzheimer's, and near the end of her life, she didn't know her name. She couldn't recognize me or even remember that she had had children. More and more of us have stories like this, and every one of them, in its own way, carries profound grief.
Hearing about a diagnosis of Alzheimer's in the family is probably the most devastating thing, because for most people it's about their personality, it's about their journeys, about the memories. Everything we are is our memories, and knowing that you're going to lose memories, knowing that you're going to forget people that you know and love in front of you. And almost everybody's seen some version of that in a movie or in a friend or a family. Now it's prevalent enough that they've seen it, and there's nothing scary. And both of us actually experienced this in our own lives with 2 grandparents each, and watching these powerful, beautiful lives dissipate in small increments, in small painful increments. There's literally nothing that's more painful than that. And that's the passion that we have to see if we can do something about it.
Dr. Daniel Amen has studied the brain for decades, and he's analyzed the results of over 160,000 brain scans. He's come up with a mnemonic, Bright Minds, to help us eat and live in ways that can greatly reduce our odds of developing Alzheimer's.
So Bright Minds is the mnemonic, and quickly, B is for blood flow. Low blood flow is the #1 brain imaging predictor of Alzheimer's disease. So we see it on SPECT, the imaging study we do at Amen Clinics. But if you have hypertension, any form of heart disease, if you're sedentary, if you smoke, if you're drinking much caffeine, if you're using marijuana or alcohol, we know all of those things lower blood flow to the brain. Exercise increases blood flow. The R is retirement and aging. Age is the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, which in my mind, I turned 68 this year. It means the older you are, the more serious you need to be about brain health. And new learning is a critical strategy to keep your brain healthy. I is for inflammation. Now, after the pandemic, a lot of people know about inflammation, but it's increased with low levels of omega-3 fatty acids. It's increased with an unhealthy microbiome. So we talk about food and brain health. Your microbiome, the 100 trillion bugs in your gut, which you get from your food, is critical to brain health. The G is genetics. We talked about, yes, there are genetic risks, but genes aren't a death sentence. What they should be is a wake-up call. If you know you have the double E4 genes, the highest risk, then being on an Alzheimer's prevention program your whole life is critical. H is head trauma, a major cause of brain trouble. T is toxins, another major cause of brain troubles from pesticides, environmental toxins, alcohol, marijuana. Anesthesia can be a toxin to the brain. M are mental health issues. If you had a high number of adverse childhood experiences, if you grew up in stress, that increases your risk. But by developing the right tiny habits for your mind, and, I believe mental health is really a daily practice. The D is diabetes, high blood sugar and being overweight. And we live in a country where 72% of people are overweight. 50% of the population is diabetic or pre-diabetic. It's just horrifying what's happening. But as your weight and blood sugar goes up, blood flow and size of your brain goes down, which should scare the fat off anyone. And so obviously diet is a critical component to being at a healthy weight, probably the most critical component. And then S is sleep. 60 million Americans have trouble sleeping, but most people don't know when you sleep, your brain cleans and washes itself. And so making sleep a priority is critical to brain health.
Dementia occurs mainly in older people, but there are other brain conditions that can afflict people at any age, including attention deficit disorder or ADD. Do diet and lifestyle make a difference for ADD also?
So ADD, like anxiety disorders, like depression, like autism, is skyrocketing. It's probably up fourfold since I did my training in the 1980s. And why? Our diets are worse than they've ever been. And the first intervention that seems to help everybody is try an elimination diet. What's that? Get rid of gluten, dairy, corn, soy, artificial dyes, and sweeteners. And what you often find, there was a study from Holland that was later replicated. 70% of children that go on an elimination diet have a dramatic improvement in their symptoms. So in my mind, I'm often thinking, well, the first thing you should do is put them on a healthy diet. And, gluten is not an essential nutrient. Dairy is not essential unless you're a baby cow. And see the impact. Now, obviously, don't replace it with Twinkies, but if you can put them on a healthy diet, a brain-healthy diet, lots of colorful fruits and vegetables, high-quality protein, healthy fat, can dramatically improve it. It doesn't mean they might not need medicine at some point, but it's never the first thing to think about unless you're trying to make money for the pharmaceutical industry.
So with ADHD and the connection to food, there's a number of studies that show that a diet that's low in fruits and vegetables and high in processed foods, added sugars, and saturated fat, all of those can contribute to ADHD. And so when I have a patient with ADHD, I take a diet history. Well, I take a diet history on everybody, but especially on ADHD, looking for where one of those factors is. And they'll say, oh, my child loves fruit. And if I just stop there, I wouldn't check. But when I do a 24-hour diet history, I'll say, yesterday they didn't have any fruit. They might love fruit, but do they get fruit? It's a whole different story. Do they actually consume the fruit? And so I'll look at that. And it's important to look at the ingredients, like some of the preservatives, some of the additives, may promote hyperactivity. And so let's look at cleaning our diet up so that we can actually improve a child's hyperactivity and their attention. The same foods that cause obesity are the same foods that cause ADHD. So a lot of them, the saturated fat, the high calorie, the high sugar foods, and the sugary drinks, all those are linked to both ADHD and to obesity. So again, it's the same underlying process that's there. It's the same, high added sugar diet. It's the same processed food diet that leads to both. So, does obesity cause ADHD? It's kind of hard to separate one from the other because the same underlying mechanisms for obesity are there for ADHD.
In the last few years, it seems like a lot of people have been facing mental health challenges. How is this connected to the pandemic, and does it have a link to diet and lifestyle?
So talking about the current state of mental health, we are definitely in a crisis around mental health because it's almost as though the pandemic also uncovered, the silent pandemic or parallel pandemic, which has been the struggles of mental health, I should say. One of the things that happened during the pandemic is that processed food sales increased when people were feeling panicked at the early parts of the pandemic, and they've continued to be increased. So they've remained at a higher level. For the first time in my career of more than 20 years, Ocean, a medication called sertraline or Zoloft is the marketed name, went on shortage in the United States. So already in the early part of the pandemic, there were so many new prescriptions for this medications that we ran out. As we moved through the pandemic, there was a very major statistical study released by the CDC which showed in summer of 2020, 11% of Americans considered or thinking of suicide, which is a huge number and very, very frightening that people were feeling that isolated, desperate, worried, concerned. But the ongoing issue has been things like long COVID, which also have symptoms of mental health involved. So people experience brain fog, fatigue, more depression, anxiety, and some of these are new diagnoses. There was also a fascinating study done by colleagues of mine at Mass General, and it was a neuroimaging study. And what it showed was in individuals who had not succumbed to a COVID infection, that they also had inflammation on studies that looked at their brain. So they had neuroinflammation even though they didn't have a COVID infection. And the conclusion was that isolation, loneliness, lack of social interaction, especially early parts of the pandemic, were impacting people's brain. So I thought that was fascinating. What we also know from current research is that there's a higher level of new onset anxiety, depression, specifically as we emerge and enter the third fall of the pandemic. So not only are we in a crisis regarding mental health, resources are low because even telehealth is not covering the number of individuals in the United States that need to be seen.
We're seeing more and more cases of depression today than possibly ever before in history. What are the causes of depression?
You can be depressed because you got COVID-19 and it caused this little inflammatory bomb to go off in your brain. You can be depressed because you have low thyroid, because you had a head injury. We know inflammation is a major cause of depression and anxiety. And so being on an anti-inflammatory diet, which is basically lots of colorful fruits and vegetables, along with healthy fat and protein, there's a linear correlation, according to one study from Australia, between the number of fruits and vegetables you eat a day and your level of happiness. And so clearly diet can make a big difference. Think donuts or bread or cupcakes, ice cream, anything that gives you your pancreas an insulin response, so a simple carbohydrate, white potatoes. When your pancreas produces a high amount of insulin takes tryptophan, which is the amino acid precursor for serotonin. That's a bigger molecule that does not compete well to get into the brain, especially in people who are depressed. And the insulin pushes tryptophan into the brain, and the brain then makes serotonin, and then you feel happier. You feel less depressed. And most people don't know that, but they do know when they eat bread, when they eat cupcakes, when they eat cookies, they feel better for a short period of time. And then they feel worse because as their blood sugar went up, the insulin that drove tryptophan into the brain, your blood sugar then drops, and then you feel like your brain is walking in mud. So then you have to redo the food. And it's where addiction becomes a big problem.
And even the more subtle conditions, depression. Who would have thought? It turns out that there are inflammatory cells at work in the brain in people that are depressed. So when you look at all these different diseases, you say, which ones aren't driven by inflammation? And when you look at what is driving inflammation, there's by far the greatest factor is the food we're eating. As I already mentioned, the fats in the diet, animal fats, you have arachidonic acid that is very pro-inflammatory, but saturated fats in general that flood through the body and the bloodstream with every fatty animal-based meal, they set off other pathways into the inflammatory cascade. So diet is so key when it comes to setting off inflammation, but guess what? One of the delights of and the power of a plant-based diet is this potent anti-inflammatory effect. Because it's plant-based, there is no arachidonic acid, so that's pulled out. The omega-3 fats are anti-inflammatory, but all the colorful fruits and vegetables are filled with antioxidants that quench free radicals, that damp down the inflammatory damage mechanisms.
Is there a link between depression and anxiety? At one level, they seem very different. People are anxious, people are depressed, but they seem to be also often connected. How does that work?
I think that's a great question as to how depression and anxiety and whether they are connected or not. Depression and anxiety are kind of like siblings. You know, they when we think about the brain chemistry, when we think about medications and what they are intended to target, they are thought of very similarly. Now, the outward expression of those conditions may seem different, but more often than not, if I clinically see one condition, I often see the other. So it's even though we define these conditions as separate, there's often a very large overlap. Part of it is the brain chemistry, part of it is that depression and anxiety almost seem to feed into each other in a certain way. So I think that it's important to understand that some of the treatments and some of even the way that we eat could impact these conditions. And I'd like people to understand that when you're eating for one mental health condition, you may actually end up improving one other symptom that you have. And this is the fascinating thing that I find with food is someone may come in telling me that they're very depressed. Then we start to make tweaks and they notice, I didn't realize I wasn't sleeping because I was actually anxious, and now I'm sleeping better. So it's really cool when we put those pieces together.
When a person is stressed and their cortisol levels go high, it activates a release of stored sugar from glycogen, from the liver, from the muscles, in order for the person to be able to run away from tigers, because that's what the body is, and it's made to do, is have this stress response, cortisol response, to help us get away from the tigers. Unfortunately, in our day and age, we're at a 24/7 cortisol shot. And that cortisol is causing the body to release the sugars so that you can run away from the tigers. Unfortunately, when you're sitting at the desk looking at the stock market and freaking out, you don't need to run away from anything, right? In fact, what I tell people is if they have a stressful response to something, I would say get out and go for a walk. Get out and just jog in place. Do some squats. Do something to help to dissipate that extra blood sugar, because otherwise that extra blood sugar is going to hurt your brain. It's going to hurt your blood vessels. It's going to raise your blood pressure.
And then we have a clearer mind on the other side of that to actually make conscious choices rather than being in reaction mode.
Absolutely, because that's what cortisol does. It turns off this part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, because that's your higher level thinking. You're running away from a tiger. You're not going to be able to solve physics problems, nor do you want to. You just want to find the nearest tree and climb it or get the heck out of the way. And that's what cortisol turns on. It turns on the reactive mode, the amygdala, the emotional piece, what I call the lizard brain, and it turns off the wizard brain.
The food we eat is a major factor in how our brains work, but as we've seen, it's far from the only one. Another huge issue is how long and how well we sleep.
Yeah, it's true, and we're learning that nutrition impacts our sleep. An optimal diet allows us to relax more deeply and to stay asleep longer, while harmful foods can make it hard to calm our bodies and minds enough to really let go and get the rest that we need. And when we're sleeping, our diets can influence whether that sleep is optimally healing and restorative to the brain or not.
So now, let's take a look at sleep and the brain.
We have a country that's deprived of sleep, and we know that if you sleep less than 7 hours, you are subject to a host of chronic things, from depression to heart disease to diabetes. So sleep is fundamental.
Sleep is such an important time, and memory consolidation usually occurs during the deeper stages of sleep. And that's why it's so critical for people to get 7 to 8 hours of deep restorative sleep on a regular basis for good memory. The glymphatic system is a very complex and a beautiful system in the brain that was recently discovered, and it includes some specialized cells and movement of fluid in the brain. And the responsibility of glymphatic system is to clear the brain of some byproducts and debris that are accumulated during the daytime. As we know, the brain is a very, very active organ, so obviously it's going to create a lot of byproducts. And these specialized cells, including microglia, only get activated when someone reaches the deeper stages of sleep. So it's critical to reach that state. Otherwise, it doesn't get activated. And there's some interesting research that shows that these microglia completely change their characteristics from one of a housekeeper to one of a destructive cell. So in many ways, when it sees even normal cells, it actually starts damaging. It's as if you have a janitorial team that goes inside a building to clear up the building. Instead of just clearing away all the debris and the byproducts and the garbage, they actually start tearing down the walls and the windows and the doors. And that's why in long-term studies of people who have been sleep deprived or who haven't had good mechanisms of activating that glymphatic system, they actually have smaller brains. There's atrophy and shrinkage of the brain.
Mitophagy is, if you've heard the term autophagy, which is basically like cellular recycling, so to speak. It's enzymatically degrading damaged and dysfunctional cell parts to rebuild healthy new ones. Mitophagy is the same process at the mitochondrial level. And basically, this is a quality control process for our mitochondria. So I always like to think of like a factory line, people sitting at a conveyor belt and inspecting items that are passing in front of them. And, every time a defective one comes by, you grab it and you toss it away, you toss it in the trash can. And that's basically a process that should be occurring every night while we sleep via this process of mitophagy, this quality control, to keep our pool of mitochondria in our cells healthy and to eliminate the parts of the mitochondria that are damaged and dysfunctional.
GABA is a neurotransmitter, and we keep learning more about the important role that it plays in supporting healthy sleep and relaxation. What is GABA, and where does it come from?
So GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. This is a neurotransmitter. It's involved in many different functions in the brain, memory consolidation, and it's involved in sleep and different phases of sleep. But perhaps most famously, it's involved in helping to increase our relaxation. So this is something that helps our brain calm down, relax, and enter sleep. When we have a deficiency in GABA, we often experience increased anxiety, increased perceived stress, increased raciness of thoughts, and what's called decreased sleep latency, which means it takes a long time to fall asleep. Sometimes people will often wake up multiple times during the middle of the night as well as a result of low levels of GABA. GABA is something that is produced in our brain and is also something that is found in our diet. We can actually consume some GABA, and there are certain foods that can help stimulate GABA production in the gut. We actually have microbes in our gut that can manufacture GABA in response to consuming certain foods. It's vital to consume a variety of different B vitamins. Folate in particular is important for production of GABA. Protein consumption is important for production of GABA. And we need to also, there are other foods that can influence this, like, for example, sauerkraut is perhaps the most notable one, that these fermented foods can actually increase the level of GABA production from the microbes in our gut. So GABA is all around a vital inhibitory neurotransmitter that helps us relax, calms our racing thoughts, helps us sleep, and we need to have adequate nutrition in order for us to synthesize adequate amounts of it.
We need GABA to become relaxed enough to sleep, and we need the right nutrients for our bodies to synthesize GABA. And that's just one important neurotransmitter. When I think of the trillions of chemical reactions that go on in our bodies every single second, and that they all require particular nutrients, it's clear that nutrition is a huge key to brain health, to sleep, and to human happiness.
So let's look at the specifics. How does your diet directly impact the health of your brain? What foods provide the nutrients that you need?
Nutrition is such an incredibly important element when it comes to brain health. It essentially creates the internal environment for our brain, and the things that we eat on a regular basis, or the foods that we're surrounded with, that are introduced into our system, can either help the neurons in the brain thrive and function better, or it causes an impediment in their function so that the brain actually spends time getting rid of all that harmful effects. So the decisions that we make every single day of what we put in our body determines how our brain functions, how we see things, how we solve problems, and how we process all the information coming to us.
Why are omega-3 fatty acids important? What are they, and where do we get them from?
Omega-3 fats are one of the two essential fats. There are two types of essential fats, omega-3s and omega-6s. And when in nutrition we talk about essential, like essential amino acids, essential anything, it means we need to get them exogenously from our environment. We don't make them ourselves. And so the recommendation is for people to get about 2 grams of ALA, alpha-linolenic acid. It's short chain omega-3 fatty acids, which is found in plant foods, concentrated though in certain plant foods. Walnuts, ground flax seeds is probably the best source. Chia seeds have some. Dark green leafy vegetables have a little bit. But that's one of the reasons why on my daily dozen recommendations of all the healthiest of healthy foods I encourage people to fit into their daily routine, I advise a tablespoon of ground flaxseed, which gets you about 2 grams of omega-3 fats. The reason we hear about omega-3 fats is because of these long-chain omega-3 fats, EPA and DHA, which our body can create from the short-chain omega-3s in plant fats, and they can also be obtained preformed in certain types of fish. Now, of course, these are essential fats. The fish don't make them. And so the fish have to get them somewhere. It turns out it comes from kind of the bottom of the aquatic food chain, and the golden algae that produce it, and then it kind of builds up. Omega-3 fats are also important for brain health. About a third of our brain by dry weight, is DHA, one of these long-chain omega-3 fats. And so there are double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trials showing that those taking long-chain omega-3 fatty acids can get a boost in cognition. So I recommend 250 milligrams of algae-based or yeast-based DHA every day.
A lot of people say the brain's made of fat, so if you want a healthy brain, you need to eat a lot of fat. What's the truth about fat and brain health?
It's true that the brain is made up of a lot of fat, and the fat that is in the brain is structural fat, so it's not storage fat. You're not going to find blobs of fat in the brain, and for the brain to use that as a source of fuel. The kind of fat that makes up the connections and the infrastructure of the brain comes from either production of cholesterol in the brain, some in the brain and in the peripheral system, and the only kind of fat that the brain needs on a regular basis to maintain the integrity of the cells and their connection is omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA, but mostly DHA. Regular consumption is very important, whether it's from seeds or algae-based omega-3 fatty acids. We need that. But apart from that, the larger molecules of fat, like saturated fats, they actually don't even pass through the blood-brain barrier to go into the brain. And it kind of is sad to hear, out there in the social media or outside about the fact that we need to consume more fat. We actually have a lot of data showing that when people consume specific types of unhealthy fats, saturated fats or trans fatty acids, instead of helping the brain, they actually start damaging the highways, the arteries that lead to nutrients and oxygen to the brain. So there's no need for us to consume saturated fats or anything else other than just making sure that we get enough DHA on a regular basis.
Our brains need DHA, and we know that fish are high in DHA, as well as another important long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, EPA. Doctors Dean and Aisha Sherzai don't eat fish. So does that mean that they think nobody should eat fish? We asked them, and this is what they had to say.
To date, there's no evidence that fish is bad. In fact, there's some evidence that smaller fish, they call it smash, is actually good. And the data shows that it's omega-3. So we don't eat fish for multiple other reasons, and we're very transparent about that for the environment, for the animals and the oceans, which we're decimating. But if you want the benefit of fish, you can get it from omega-3 supplements. You can, and the studies have been done to show that, and that's where we are. I want to make sure that we are very transparent about this, because then it gives us greater legitimacy out there that says we're not ideologues. We're not sticking to an ideology. We're science-based. So for people who want to eat fish, I can't say that it's bad for you. In fact, there's some evidence that it's good. We worry, though, because there are no fish out there that is not contaminated. We don't check all the contamination. On rare basis, we check mercury and lead, and maybe a couple of other things. But they found thousands of other chemicals in fish, which are actually concentrators. The bigger the fish, the more concentrated, that we don't check at all. So we worry about the long-term effect of eating those kind of animals.
What about carbohydrates? Should we be worried about their effect on brain health, or is it okay to eat them?
I often distinguish between smart carbs and dumb carbs. Dumb carbs are devoid of nutrients and they spike your blood sugar. So if you often think of white bread, white rice, white potatoes, sugary foods, and we celebrate with alcohol and we celebrate with sugar. It's like, no, it's the wrong message. And so when I think of a dumb carb, it's high glycemic, which means it quickly turns to sugar, and it's low in fiber. And smart carbs are the opposite. They're low glycemic. I had blueberries this morning, and they're high in fiber. And you can find the glycemic of any fruit just by Googling it. And you want to stay under 60 because you don't want it to spike your blood sugar. And bread, whether it's wheat or white bread, is higher actually than table sugar. In fact, you have an enzyme in your saliva, in your mouth, called amylase, where if you chew a piece of bread long enough, it begins to taste like sugar.
I've noticed that. Even rice. You can chew brown rice for long enough, it gets sweet, doesn't it?
brown rice and white rice, they're not that far away on the glycemic index, but at least brown rice has more fiber in it. And so it tends to be more satiating.
Are there specific foods that are good for your memory? You bet there are.
I love blueberries. Blueberries are my favorite snack food. I like to call them brain berries. They help with blood flow to the brain. They're full of antioxidants, which are very neuroprotective also as well. It's a good source of fiber. Also have a lot of water in them. We're talking about staying hydrated and so on. So I love my blueberries or my brain berries. I love most berries.
The Neuro9 is a self-serving acronym because we're neurologists and we wanted to create a system for people to easily remember the foods that are most beneficial for brain health. And at the risk of sounding gimmicky, this information was retrieved from multiple papers that have looked at dietary patterns that are healthy for the brain. And when you look at the data, it's essentially variation of the same thing. Eat more plants, reduce your processed foods, and reduce specific types of foods. So the Neuro9 include here's a memory test for me. So green leafy vegetables, which are incredible. There have been multiple studies that have shown that when people eat even one serving of green leafy vegetables, they actually have their brain age 11 years younger as compared to those who don't eat it. So it really is a phenomenal food. And that includes spinach and arugula and collard greens, etc. The next food category is cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, kale, cabbage, cauliflower. They have specific compounds like sulforaphane that fights inflammation and oxidative byproducts. The next one is whole grains. Whole grains have been deemed, as the villain of the food groups for many years, unfortunately. But we have a lot of data that shows that grains that are whole, that are organic, they actually tend to be very healthy because they provide the B vitamins necessary for brain health and also a phenomenal source of fiber. Then we have beans, which are beans or legumes that are very healthy sources of plant-based proteins. Then we have nuts and seeds, great sources of mono and polyunsaturated fats, good fats that the brain can use, and it also has multiple micronutrients. Then we have nuts and seeds were separate, so that's 6. Then we have green tea. Green tea has EGCG, a compound that has been studied as it relates to brain health and such a strong antioxidant. How can I forget berries? So blueberries specifically has been studied extensively, and I know you love blueberries, Ocean. The wonderful compounds in blueberries, the colored compounds, the flavonols, are very strong antioxidants, and they act like little soldiers in the body and in the brain fighting off the inflammatory byproducts. So, and as far as seeds are concerned, things like flax and chia seeds are very good sources of omega-3 fatty acids that get converted into DHA in the body. It might be very small, but still they actually have very wonderful effects on brain health in general. And then replacing our salt and replacing these strong flavors like salt and sugar with spices and herbs like cilantro, rosemary, sage. And these have been used for thousands of years as medicine, and now we know that they have very strong compounds. Pound for pound, they're one of the strongest anti-inflammatory compounds in the world, and flavoring our foods with herbs and spices is a beautiful way to go. As a matter of fact, we did some studies on specifically turmeric. Turmeric is a spice that, one of its components is called curcumin, and curcumin has the potential to cross the blood-brain barrier and deposit in the extracellular spaces of the neurons and can even go inside the neurons. And we did a couple of studies that looked at the retina, which is an extension of the brain. And when people consume curcumin, it actually deposits in the retina, and it could potentially have anti-amyloid properties, which essentially means that it absorbs amyloid and could potentially reduce the burden of amyloid in the brain. Now, there's still many studies that are being done, but it really is a good potential source of getting rid of amyloid from the brain.
In this episode, you've heard from some of the world's top brain experts about simple changes you can make to slash your risk of dementia, restore mental clarity, and even boost your mood. I find this to be incredibly empowering because it shows us that the power to create change is far more in our hands than most of us ever realize.
It's so true, and this stuff really works. Studies show that an optimal diet alone can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's by 53%. And when you combine optimal nutrition with exercise, healthy sleep, and all the other lifestyle factors that can tilt the odds in your favor, it's really possible to enjoy a healthier brain at every age and every stage of life.
We've seen that a healthy diet and lifestyle has a profound impact on your risk of heart disease and on your risk of Alzheimer's. But as important as that is, the most feared disease in the world is actually something else. In fact, some people are so afraid of this disease that they don't even like to say its name and refer to it rather by its first letter. They call it the C word. In this next episode, we will explore the link between food and cancer. Does this disease just happen to us, like many people think? Or can we eat and live in a way that substantially reduces our risk? And is it also connected to another one of the world's most prevalent and dangerous diseases, diabetes? We're going to find out.
It's time for a food revolution.
It's time for a food revolution.
It's time.
It's time.
It is time for a food revolution.